Welcome to everyone who took the time this evening to join me in honoring Charlie Kirk. As the president of our new Turning Point chapter here at Sheridan College,
Good morning, my friends, and welcome to another weekend update. From very high above all the puerile and insipid forms of Wyoming mainstream media, this is Cowboy State Politics. I, of course, am your illustrious host, David Iverson, firmly ensconced behind the silver Cowboy State Politics microphone and broadcasting to you from the base of the Bighorns at the Cowboy State Politics studio in Sheridan, Wyoming. Good morning, my friends, and welcome to the program. Happy Saturday. There isn't a ton of news that happens in Wyoming day in and day out, and sometimes in a given week, there really isn't all that much to talk about either. But the past week and a half has been nothing short of tumultuous. Not because of a dearth of news stories, but because of one in particular. I have to wonder if this is what it felt like the week of April 4th, 1968, when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. I think if you ask most people, they would probably tell you that they revere Martin Luther King Jr., but they probably couldn't tell you all that much about him. Except, of course, that he gave a speech on the National Mall in which he said, "I have a dream," and that we should focus on the content of one's character and not the color of their skin. And most people would probably be able to tell you that he was a civil rights leader, that he was arrested numerous times during protests. All of that stuff is pretty commonplace, and I think that it exists in the mythology surrounding Martin Luther King Jr. And that mythology, the public perception around Martin Luther King Jr. was happening in real time. And just like today, the majority of the public's relative detachment from actual facts in favor of focusing on headlines helped reinforce that public perception. Now, of course, in 1968, you didn't have the internet and social media, YouTube, and instantaneous communication, so it took a little while. But nonetheless, pretty quickly, both sides of the narrative were being crafted. Those who were sympathetic to the cause of Martin Luther King Jr. loved him. And those folks on the other side, well, they hated him. And I have to think that if those events of 1968 were somehow transported today, you'd see the very same type of reaction on social media that you are with Charlie Kirk. However, if that were to happen, the numerous character flaws of Martin Luther King Jr. would have come to light a lot sooner. Our cancel culture being what it is, it's very likely that Martin Luther King Jr. may not have been the guy on the National Mall giving that speech. But there again, God has a habit of putting the people that he wants in places where you might least expect them. But it's a curious thought experiment to think of what the reaction to Martin Luther King Jr. would have been had he lived during our time. I'll get into more of that in just a little bit, but I want to take some time to just talk about the narratives that are being created. I'm sure on April 5th of 1968, the printing presses at America's newspapers went into overdrive. Some of them assuredly revered Martin Luther King Jr., while others printed a response that, let's just say, was probably more tepid. And you're seeing the exact same thing today. It's just happening a lot faster. The main difference between today and in 1968 is now everything is recorded. As far as Charlie Kirk is concerned, about the only thing that isn't recorded about him is his conversations with his wife, Erica. Other than that, though, the man's life was very, very public. Today, the mainstream media smear machine is having a lot harder time painting Charlie Kirk as anything other than the good guy that he was. But don't think that they're not trying. Let me give you an example from Wyoming. To the cow pie in an article that is now entitled, "Wyoming Democrats Saddened by Trump Reaction to Charlie Kirk Shooting." The headline used to read, "Wyoming Democrats Repulsed by Trump Reaction." The cow pie's stealth editing aside, here's what it says, and I quote, Rothfuss, that is, Senator Chris Rothfuss from Laramie, acknowledged the chorus of voices on the left celebrating Kirk's killing and the overthrow of violence in the wake of George Floyd's 2020 death by a police officer's actions. But those have been reactions, albeit inappropriate, to oppression, he said, not an intrinsic feature of Democratic policy goals. In Rothfuss's view, Kirk also used hateful strategies, racism in particular, end quote. Most people don't dig any further than a couple of paragraphs below the headline of any article. Not you, of course. If you listen to Cowboy State Politics, you're well informed that most of what the Democrats say and much of what is printed in the Wyoming media is bullcrap. And that often, those two things are pretty much the same. But the media line, and evidently the Wyoming Democrats line, that Charlie Kirk is, now wait for it now, a racist. I should have some sort of drum roll soundbite every time I mention an article in which the Democrats use that old trope. There are two big reasons why the Democrats and much of the mainstream media are trying to paint Charlie Kirk as a racist. The first one is that's all they've got. They don't have a better argument. And because pretty much everything that Charlie Kirk ever said is recorded, there's plenty of material for them to take out of context. And they are, by the way. The second reason why Chris Rothfuss, the cow pie, and just about everybody else in the media is attempting to call Charlie a racist is that it is one of the few terms that has such negative connotations to it that most of the time you don't have to have any evidence to back it up. You just call somebody a racist and then they are immediately put on the defensive. And by the time they've disproven your claim, enough people have already heard you call them a racist that it is almost an accepted fact. That's what Chris Rothfuss and a countless number of people online are trying to do right now. It's not going to work, of course, because there's already an army of people out defending Charlie Kirk's good name. Just like last night in Sheridan, a group of students from Sheridan College, the new Turning Point chapter at Sheridan College, held a prayer vigil for Charlie Kirk on the Sheridan College campus. I would say, without counting, there was an easy 200 people there. It was a great event. We sang a song and prayed for about 30 minutes. Here's a little piece of what the new president of the Turning Point chapter at Sheridan College had to say.
This flame that has started in our country to revive what has been lost will not be extinguished. The same God who gave Charlie his voice and his courage is the God who reigns over eternity. In his sovereignty, he calls us to carry forward the mission to live boldly, speak truth, and love well. Love one another like Christ has loved you. Go forward not in the spirit of left or right, but in pursuit of what is good and what is true and what is lasting. Have compassion, have grace, and have humility. Just as Jesus says in Matthew, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Tonight, as you go forward, pray for Charlie's family. Pray for his wife and his kids, his mother and father. Pray for his sister. Pray for his close friends. Pray for those that he mentored and those who mentored him.
My plan is to have those students on the program at some point, but I'll let you know when I confirm that interview. The gathering at Sheridan College was a pretty good mix of different ages, students from the school and community members, both young and old. And so if there's a couple hundred people in Little Sheridan, Wyoming that show up to a prayer vigil for somebody they most likely never met, just imagine what is happening across the country. In the end, the left is most definitely not going to win this one. But like I said, that's not going to stop them from trying. So the other thing that I wanted to do on this morning's program is to give you some ammunition to use against those people who are calling Charlie Kirk a racist and who are also, by the way, calling you a racist for believing in him. I've often told you that when it comes to history, some of the people you think are heroes turn out to be villains. And some of the people you think are villains, well, sometimes they turn out to be not so villainous after all. One of the big reasons why the media is trying to paint Charlie Kirk as a racist is that he spent some time, a considerable amount of time, researching who exactly Martin Luther King Jr. was. And in 2023, at America Fest, he had the audacity to suggest that perhaps they should have a quick conversation about who the real Martin Luther King Jr. was, because like all historical figures, and us, by the way, he definitely was not a perfect man. In many ways, far from it. Now, before I go into this, let me just tell you that often we create mythologies around historical figures. A classic one is the George Washington chopping down a cherry tree story and then telling his parents, "I cannot tell a lie, I did it." That is apocryphal. There's absolutely zero evidence whatsoever that that ever happened. But that fable, that story, has been taught to school children, myself included, for decades, all in an effort to create a mythology surrounding George Washington as being the most honest and indispensable man that ever walked the face of the earth. I hate to tell George Washington this, but that title has already been taken by Jesus. But anyway, we create mythologies around historical figures that, in many cases, are born from historical fact. But they're stretched to such a point that, in the end, sometimes they bear very little resemblance to who those people actually were. That charge applies in many ways to Martin Luther King Jr. Today's edition of Weekend Update is brought to you by Morton Buildings. Pretty soon, that white stuff is going to start flying around, and you're going to be pretty disappointed when all of your fun summertime playthings are covered up with a giant snowbank. You could prevent all of that simply by calling Marcos and Jesse at Morton Buildings. Their phone number is 307-674-2532. They're the experts in metal building construction. They've been doing it longer than anybody else around, and they do a much better job. So it doesn't matter what type of building you're thinking about, whether a garage or a big giant barn or shop or maybe a huge warehouse for your business. The two guys to talk to are Marcos and Jesse. Again, their phone number is 307-674-2532, or you can check them out at their website, mortonbuildings.com. Speaking of snow, when you have to go out in it, or if you get caught in it, there's nothing worse than having cold feet. To prevent that unfortunate circumstance, you should get a pair of socks from the Buffalo Wool Company. They are the finest socks that I've ever put on my feet. To get you a pair, go to their website, thebuffalowoolco.com. Trust me, you won't be disappointed. Make sure that you subscribe and follow the program. That way you can be notified every single time there's a brand new episode of Cowboy State Politics. To do that, go to the website, cowboystatepolitics.com, or anywhere that you get your podcasts. And now, back to the program. So first, let me just play for you what Charlie Kirk said about Martin Luther King Jr., the proverbial match that lit the racist charge coming from the left. Here it is.
You've described Martin Luther King Jr. as awful.
There is a mythology around MLK that does not warrant the reverence that he gets treated with in America. Should he be mentioned amongst lots of people in the 20th century that was complicated and at the end of his life advocated for a more communistic view and then actually got away from race blindness and actually got towards race obsession? I'm totally cool with that. He did some great things. He did some things that were not so great. In America, though, you must understand, he is looked to as the new founding father. The main contention that I have with the Civil Rights Act and the Civil Rights Movement and how it ended, not how it started, is that we refounded the country fundamentally. We cast aside our founding roots and our founding documents, the U.S. Constitution, and we decided to basically usher in the Civil Rights Act as a new anti-racist dogma, creed, and I find something fundamentally wrong with that. Our birth certificate as Americans is the Declaration, and the law of the land is tied with the U.S. Constitution. It was not the Civil Rights Act.
Many of you, and most definitely your children, probably believe that Martin Luther King Jr. was this great guy that pushed the envelope of civil rights in this country, and that ultimately that led to the Civil Rights Act of 1965. The feeling of most of the media and probably most of the people in American education is that to denigrate Martin Luther King Jr. is tantamount to racism. And that's the charge that the left is using against Charlie Kirk. Or at the very least, that's one of them. So was Martin Luther King Jr. a good guy? Is this the sum total? Is this the defining characteristic of Martin Luther King Jr.? And is this how he acted, led his life, and believed?
Even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream.
I believe that words have power. I really do. And that was an amazing speech. But the question is that all that it was? I don't think so. I think that words have power, and those certainly did. But as a society, we have built a mythology around that speech, and we have disregarded exactly who the guy was that said all of those things. The question for you when I get to the end of today's episode is, are the things that you are about to learn about Martin Luther King Jr., are those things of such gravity that they change the mythology that we've built up around Martin Luther King Jr. to such a degree that it changes your view overall of the civil rights movement and of race relations as they exist today? That's the question. And so, was Martin Luther King Jr. a good guy? The short answer to that is no, he really wasn't. Martin Luther King Jr. was a self-described minister at Ebenezer Baptist Church. He was a minister that repeatedly cheated on his wife, at least 12 heavily documented times. Let me just give you one piece of evidence to support this. The New York Daily News published an article entitled, "We Need to Face the Whole Truth About Martin Luther King Jr." in June of 2019. Quote, "It's very old news that Martin Luther King Jr. was a serial adulterer." End quote. Here's another one. The London Sunday Times wrote in May 26 of 2019 in an article entitled, "FBI Tapes Reveal Martin Luther King Jr.'s Affairs with 40 Women." Quote, "A huge archive of documents recently released from Federal Bureau of Investigation files exposes in detail King's extramarital sexual activities with dozens of women and as he traveled the country campaigning against racial inequality." I think it's a pretty fair argument that if you claim to be a minister and you're cheating on your wife with dozens of other women, it kind of means you're not a good guy. That same piece in the Times details other FBI recordings in which King and some of his other friends were engaging in, well, we'll just say for the purposes of this episode, and without going into lurid details that are listed in the FBI reports, orgies. It's pretty shocking, isn't it? Another excerpt from that New York Daily News piece says, quote, "But King's reported behavior is consistent with an earlier account by one of his closest confidants, Ralph Abernathy, who wrote that King hit one of his mistresses on the last night of his life. And Garrow, the author of a new book coming out about Dr. King, is a meticulous scholar, already known for his dogged efforts to document the FBI's harassment of King." While it's fair to criticize some of the more lurid details in Garrow's book, one thing is for certain, Dr. Martin Luther King was a serial adulterer, and you thought Tiger Woods was bad. And later on in his life, after the '65 Civil Rights Act, his own writings tended more towards Marxism and communism than they did anything else. During an April 1967 appearance at the New York City Riverside Church, King said, quote, "A true revolution of values will soon look uneasily on the glaring contrast of poverty and wealth. With righteous indignation, we will look across the seas and see individual capitalists of the West investing huge sums of money in Asia, Africa, and South America, only to take the profits out with no concern for the social betterment of the countries, and say, this is not just," end quote. In King's last book, entitled Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, he openly said he's supportive of a universal basic income. Of course, that's what we would call it today, but that's clearly what Martin Luther King Jr. meant. Now, I've often told you that history is neither good or bad. It just is. And when we know the truth about historical figures, it does, in some ways, help us understand the world where we're at. Did Martin Luther King Jr. do some good things? Absolutely, without a doubt. But did he also do some things that were terrible? That part is true also. Stating and learning the truth about him doesn't make you a racist. It means that you're more well-informed about who historical figures are. But I also think it helps inform why we're at where we're at. That there is very little that is black and white. And at best, sometimes, it's just a little bit complicated. And in Martin Luther King Jr.'s case, it's a lot complicated. Maybe in a different episode, we can talk about some of the results of the 1965 Civil Rights Act, because I tend to agree with Charlie Kirk that the way that it is being used right now is so far removed from its original intent that it is the exact opposite of what Martin Luther King Jr. spoke about on the National Mall. Think about it. DEI, merely focusing on immutable characteristics that people have no control over whatsoever, the color of their skin, what gender they were born with, and even so, the 65 Civil Rights Act is now being used to validate claims that couldn't possibly be true, that men can become women or that women can become men. And if you even think about challenging that absurd idea, then you're branded a homophobe or a bigot or pick any pejorative that you want. That is what the media is attempting to do to the memory of Charlie Kirk. The difference between right now and what was happening after April 4th of 1968 is that some of those charges against Martin Luther King Jr. were absolutely true. But at least now, you have the facts on at least one of those charges against Charlie Kirk. Well, that'll about do it for today's installment of the program. Have a good rest of your weekend, and we'll talk again on Monday. But for now, from the base of the Bighorns at the Cowboy State Politics Studio, I'm David Iverson, and this is the one and only Cowboy State Politics.